What was supposed to be a routine photo shoot turned into a very costly disaster for the United States Air Force. General Electric, designer and manufacturer of the powerful engines of the XB-70 and Valkyr, wanted some promotional photographs of these 5 planes with engines from that company. When the photography team boarded their Learjet for the photo shoot, no one could have anticipated the outcome. Just after taking the last photo of the day, a Lockheed F-104N, piloted by National Aeronautics and Space Administration's chief test pilot Joseph Walker, was sucked into a vortex of the gigantic XB-70. The F-104 flipped over the top of the enormous bomber, which would lose control and crash into the ground. And this is the story we are going to see in a new video from the black box of aviation world. The trend during the 50s and 60s in the midst of the Cold War was for bombers to fly as fast and high as possible to avoid anti-aircraft defenses, but interceptor planes had also been developed to counter this threat and hunt down this type of aircraft. The United States then wanted to build a bomber that could not be reached by interceptors. In 1955, the United States Air Force, or the United States Air Force, issued the General Operational Requirement 38, in which it was requested to study beginnings for a new plane that could carry the load of a B-52 at a speed of a B-58 Hustler, superior to Mach 2. But this future bomber would also carry nuclear weapons. At this time, nuclear weapons weighed several tons and had to have a great capacity to carry enough fuel to transport that payload from the United States to the Soviet Union. During that same period, only 2 weapons proved to be effective against bombers, fighter planes, and anti-aircraft artillery. Flying higher and faster made this task more difficult for both. In 1958, North American Aviation presented the design of the XB-70, which, by the way, we had already made a video talking about this aircraft in depth. I leave it up to the right for you to see it later. After presenting this proposal, North American won a contract with the government to build 2 prototypes. Construction started in 1960. By the time the first components were being manufactured, the bomber project was already on its deathbed. The emergence of ground-to-air guided missiles made them vulnerable, and therefore the cost-benefit ratio was impossible, but it would later continue with another mission. The introduction of the first effective anti-aircraft missiles in the late 50s dramatically changed the focus of high-altitude bombers. Now these missiles had a higher altitude capability than any other aircraft. The United States was aware of Soviet work in this field. In 1960, a U-2 flown by Gary Powers was shot down by one of the first Soviet-guided air defense missiles, the 675 Vina. Never before had an aircraft flying as high as a U-2 been able to be shot down. Faced with this problem, military doctrine had already begun to move away from the high-altitude supersonic bomber towards low-altitude penetration or interdiction. Radars are line of sight. Therefore, planes could drastically shorten detection distances by flying close to the Earth and hiding behind the terrain. While it was almost certain that the plane was not going to become a bomber after a cost of $800 million, which is equivalent to $7.5 billion today, the XB-70S were destined to be used in the advanced study of aerodynamics, propulsion, and other topics related to large supersonic transports. The crew was reduced to just 2 pilots, as a navigator and a bomber were not needed for this research function. The first prototype was completed on May 7, 1964. Its first flight was in September that year. The Valkyr had been designed to fly above its own turbulence. The wingtips would bend downwards during subsonic flight, which increased lift at low speed. At high speed, the canard planes generated an airflow that allowed its large delta wing to receive enough flow to generate thrust. This allowed him to prove that once the subsonic to supersonic transition was overcome, there were no time limits to maintain flight at more than Mach 1, and it is a fact that would be key to think about passenger flights. With the data obtained after 128 test flights, Conclusions were drawn that would later lead to the development of the Rockwell B-1 Lancer and to the proof of concept of the SST project supersonic transport, as the United States sought to be one of the countries that would have a supersonic passenger plane like the European Concorde or the Soviet Tu-144. But the tests ended abruptly on June 8, 1966. That day, prototype number 2 had suffered a horrible accident. Edwards Base, north of Los Angeles, was the home of the XB-70 test flights. During one of the Valkyr research flights, General Electric pulls strings and tries to convince the base commanders to allow a photo session with the planes carrying their engines. The Valkyr carried 6 of one of their most revolutionary engine designs, the General Electric IJ-93. After getting an affirmative response, this manufacturer mobilized 6 planes. Apart from the Valkyr, piloted by Colonel Al White, and Major Kirk Cross, a Learjet 24, from which photos and video would be taken, a McDonnell Douglas F-4, B Phantom II with its J-79 engine, a Northrop T-38, a Talon with its J-85 engine, another Northrop I-5A with the same power plant, and a Lockheed F-104N Starfighter from National Aeronautics and Space Administration under the command of Joe Walker, who opposed the photo session from the beginning. He said that no relevant data would be obtained in that formation flight. And it was true, it only served General Electric for advertising. After the photo session that was going normally, the F-104 began to get closer and closer to the Valkyr. It was then that Walker, at 9:26 local time, got caught in a vortex generated by the bomber's turbulence and lost control of the starfighter. He had no way of getting it out of there. The tail stabilizer of the F-104 touches the wingtip of the XB-70 and comes off. The F-104, without a vertical stabilizer, raises its nose and does an inverted barrel roll over the XB-70, hits one of the vertical stabilizers and rips the other one out completely, exploding into a ball of fire as it falls and moves away. Collision, screams over Captain Hawk's radio, pilot of the T-38. "You lost the verticals," says Joe Cotton, the navigator of the same T-38. They went out left and right. The crew of the XB-70 informs him and adds, "We stay with you, nothing happens, you are doing well." Incredibly, the Valkyr continues to fly straight and level. It holds steady as if nothing had happened. It continues forward without vertical stabilizers until 16 seconds after the impact, the North American Aviation XB-70 begins to irretrievably tilt to the right. The Learjet continues to take photos despite the constant orders from the rest of the formation pilots. "Get the Learjet out of here," they said, while the XB-70 spirals into an irreversible spiral. Reversible. The pilots try to save the ship until they realize it's impossible, and that's when they decide to start the ejection process. The Valkyr has an escape pod system, as the exit from a simple ejector seat was not viable at the height and speed this aircraft flew. Co-pilot Colonel Al White reaches one of the pods as the G-forces grow exponentially. The capsule door traps his right arm, tearing it off. Seconds later, he is ejected from the ship. He would survive, but with tremendous injuries. Major Carcross, who was piloting the XB-70 for the first time, crashes the plane in the desert. Even though this section is called Black Box, it should be noted that this plane, like most military aircraft, does not carry a black box precisely that would record what was happening in the cockpit, so we do not know what the reactions of the Valkyr crew were. The destruction of prototype number 2 meant much more than the loss of the device or the 2 lives, that of Walker in the F-104 and that of Cross in the Valkyr. It also cost the United States its SST program never would see the light, an American supersonic passenger plane. The first prototype completed the test flights that were contracted for the project and flew for the last time in 1969 until its final resting place in the Wright-Patterson Air Force Museum near Dayton, Ohio. In subsequent research, it was determined that both General Electric and the advertising agency, BBDO, had exerted pressure due to marketing needs. This BBDO agency did not participate in any campaign related to the Air Force again. Photo sessions of these characteristics have not been repeated to date either. The Air Force sanctioned commanders and public relations personnel from the base for not having opposed the execution of the flight under these conditions. Severe corrections were also made to the existing procedures. North American aviation suffered a fatal blow with this. Less than a year later, with the fire of the Apollo 1 space module, it received the other and was absorbed by the Rodwell Company, later purchased by Boeing. And so concludes this black box story. I hope you liked it. If so, give it a like and share it. And if you want to help financially to improve the channel, you have the new thank you button below the video, as well as the PayPal, Patreon, and Mercado Pago means. See you in a new installment of Aviation World. Thank you.